Down to his last $750 and sleeping in a budget motel after losing his career, home and marriage, former presidential historian Thomas Anderson made what everyone called a foolish decision, buying a dilapidated farm at a county foreclosure auction that no one else would touch. What he uncovered beneath the crumbling colonial barn wouldn't just solve his financial troubles. It would reveal presidential secrets that powerful people have kept buried for over 2 centuries. Secrets that would rewrite American history forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Thomas Anderson stared at his bank account balance on the screen of his cracked phone, $708.43. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, trying to push away the crushing weight of how far he had fallen. Just 14 months ago, he had been a respected presidential historian with a teaching position at a prestigious university, a beautiful colonial home in a desirable neighborhood, and enough in savings to feel secure. Now, at 42, he was living out of a rundown motel on the outskirts of Oakridge, Virginia, rationing meals and watching his remaining funds dwindle with alarming speed. The scandal had blindsided him. Tom had been researching what he believed would be his career-defining book, a comprehensive analysis of classified presidential communications during national crises. His university connections had granted him special access to recently declassified archives. But when sensitive documents from his research mysteriously appeared online, fingers pointed directly at him. Though he maintained his innocence, the University swiftly terminated his position to contain the scandal. His academic reputation was destroyed overnight. The legal fees had drained his savings. Publishers cancelled his book contract. Then came the foreclosure on his house, followed by Sarah asking for a divorce after 12 years of marriage. "I don't even recognize you anymore, Tom," she had said, packing her suitcases. "You're so obsessed with these dusty presidential secrets that you've forgotten how to live in the present." Tom had argued, insisted he was being framed, begged her to believe in him, but in the end he couldn't blame her for leaving. The man she had married, confident, successful, secure, had disappeared along with everything else. As he sat in his motel room, the worn bedspread dotted with his scattered job rejection letters, Tom noticed the local newspaper he'd picked up at the motel lobby. A small advertisement caught his eye. County foreclosure auction, historic properties available. Most listings showed starting bids far beyond his means, but one property stood out, Hillcrest Farm, a colonial-era property with a starting bid of just $700. The listing described a historically significant but severely neglected farm property, with original colonial-era structures in need of extensive renovation. The accompanying photo showed a weathered farmhouse with sagging roof, a dilapidated barn, and overgrown fields. According to the brief description, the property had once belonged to the Monroe family, though not directly to the former president himself, just distant relatives. It had been abandoned for nearly a decade after the previous owner died, with substantial tax debt. Tom felt an inexplicable pull toward the property. As a historian specializing in presidential history, anything connected to President Monroe naturally piqued his interest. More importantly, the property represented something he desperately needed: a chance to start over, a roof over his head that wouldn't drain his account in monthly motel fees, and perhaps a project to occupy his mind beyond his ruined career. The auction was scheduled for the following morning at the Westland County Courthouse. Tom spent a restless night weighing the decision. Was he desperate enough to spend his last dollars on a dilapidated farm he knew nothing about maintaining? Did he have any other options left? By dawn, fatigue and desperation had made the decision for him. The auction room in the basement of the courthouse was smaller than Tom had expected. with folding chairs arranged in rows before a simple podium. About 20 people milled about, most dressed in business attire or practical work clothes. Real estate investors, contractors, and property flippers, Tom assumed. He felt conspicuously out of place in his rumpled button-down shirt and the only pair of decent pants he hadn't sold. The auctioneer, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, moved efficiently through the properties. Modern homes in desirable neighborhoods started bidding wars that quickly reached hundreds of thousands. Commercial lots went for even more. Tom waited anxiously as the available properties dwindled, hoping the Hillcrest farm wouldn't attract similar interest. Finally, the auctioneer announced, "Next we have the Hillcrest farm property, tax ID number 8675309. Approximately 40 acres with original colonial-era farmhouse and outbuildings. Property sold as is with all existing structures. County assessment. Notes significant structural issues and no functional utilities. Starting bid $700. The room fell silent. People shuffled through their papers. A few whispered to each other, but no hands went up. $700 for a historical property, folks, the auctioneer prompted. Yes, it needs work, but 40 acres of Virginia farmland alone is worth considering. More silence. Tom's heart raced. Do I hear $700 for the Hillcrest property? The auctioneer repeated. Tom raised his hand. 700, he said, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet room. We have $700, the auctioneer noted. Do I hear 750? No response. $725 perhaps? Silence. Going once for $700, going twice. Sold to the gentleman in the back for $700. Just like that, Tom had become a property owner again. As he approached the clerk's table to complete the paperwork and arrange payment, he noticed curious glances from the other attendees. A middle-aged woman in a county office blazer processed his paperwork with raised eyebrows. You know why no one bid on that place, right? She asked as she stamped his deed. Because it needs significant repairs, Tom ventured. The clerk, whose nameplate read Margaret Walsh, lowered her voice. That's part of it, but Hillcrest has a reputation. Strange noises, lights in the windows when there's no electricity, unusual visitors in the night. The last owner, old Mr. Hargrove, became increasingly paranoid before he died, claimed someone was trying to access something hidden on the property. Tom wasn't sure how to respond. I don't put much stock in ghost stories. It's not ghosts. When people talk about, Margaret replied, handing him the keys and final paperwork. It's something else entirely, and you being a historian and all. Tom froze. How did you know I'm a historian? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Margaret smiled. Small town, Mr. Anderson. News travels. We don't get many disgraced presidential historians moving to Oakridge. She must have seen his expression fall because she quickly added, for what it's worth, not everyone believes what they read in the papers. Some of us understand that powerful people protect their secrets fiercely. This unexpected comment caught Tom off guard. Before he could inquire further, another buyer approached the table, ending their conversation. Margaret handed him a folder with his property documents and keys. The utilities have been off for years, she explained efficiently, back to business. You'll need to contact the county water department and power company to restore services. And Mr. Anderson, be careful out there. Some things are buried for a reason. With that cryptic warning, she turned to the next buyer, leaving Tom clutching the keys to his new property, a property that had consumed nearly all of his remaining money. The drive to Hillcrest Farm took almost 40 minutes, the roads becoming increasingly narrow and overgrown as Tom left the small town of Oakridge behind. When he finally turned onto the long gravel driveway, the reality of his purchase hit him with full force. The farmhouse stood on a gentle rise, looking even more dilapidated up close than in the auction photos. The white paint had long since peeled away, exposing weathered grey wood beneath. Several windows were broken or boarded up, and the front porch had partially collapsed on one side. Behind the house, an old barn listed dangerously to the right, and what might have once been productive fields were now overgrown with weeds, small trees, and wild vegetation. "What have I done?" Tom whispered to himself as he parked his decade-old sedan beside the house. He had spent his last meaningful sum of money on a property that might be beyond saving, with no experience in renovation or farming, and apparently, according to local gossip, some kind of mysterious reputation. The front door key stuck in the rusted lock, requiring considerable jiggling before it finally turned. The door opened with a prolonged creak, revealing a dim interior heavy with dust and the musty odor of abandonment. Tom pulled out his phone flashlight to survey his new home. The interior was in marginally better condition than the exterior, though decades of neglect were evident everywhere. The main floor contained a central hallway with rooms branching off to either side, a parlor, dining room, and what appeared to be a study on one side, a large country kitchen, pantry, and mudroom on the other. The floors were wide plank hardwood, scratched and worn but largely intact. The wallpaper, once patterned with colonial-style motifs, now hung in peeling strips, exposing lath and plaster beneath. Old furniture remained scattered throughout, a moth-eaten sofa in the parlor, a heavy oak table in the dining room, kitchen cabinets with doors hanging from single hinges. It looked as though the previous owner had simply walked away one day, leaving decades of accumulated possessions behind. A narrow staircase led to the second floor, where Tom found 4 bedrooms in varying states of disrepair. The smallest appeared to have been used as storage, with stacks of old newspapers, boxes of books, and assorted household items piled nearly to the ceiling. The largest, presumably the master bedroom, contained a 4-poster bed with a sagging mattress, an antique dresser, and a rocking chair positioned near the window. This exploration left Tom feeling simultaneously overwhelmed and oddly hopeful. The house was in terrible condition, yes, but it was structurally sound despite the cosmetic issues. With work, a great deal of work, it could become livable again. As evening approached, Tom returned to his car to retrieve his few possessions: a duffel bag of clothing, a sleeping bag, a cooler with some basic food items, and a box containing his most treasured books and research materials, all that remained of his former life. He selected the second largest bedroom to make his temporary camp, the one with the fewest water stains on the ceiling. After sweeping away the worst of the dust and debris, Tom spread his sleeping bag on the floor, positioned his battery-powered lantern nearby, and sat down to eat a dinner of cold sandwich and warm soda. As darkness fell completely, the old house came alive with noises: creaking timbers, rustling in the walls, mice, he assumed, and the low whistle of wind finding its way through countless gaps in the building's envelope. Sleep proved elusive as Tom lay in his sleeping bag, staring at the shadows dancing across the ceiling from his lantern light. Had he made a catastrophic mistake? Was this desperate purchase just the final chapter in his professional and personal collapse? Or could this remote, dilapidated farm somehow become the fresh start he so desperately needed? Tomorrow, he decided, he would explore the outbuildings and begin formulating a plan. He needed to prioritize repairs, determine what he could realistically accomplish himself, and figure out how to stretch his remaining $82.43 until he could find some source of income. Perhaps he could sell some of the antique furniture. Maybe the surrounding land held some agricultural potential. There had to be a way forward. As exhaustion finally overtook him, Tom's last thoughts were of the clerk's cryptic warning and the previous owner's paranoia about something hidden on the property. Strange how life had led him here, from researching presidential secrets in academic archives to sleeping on the floor of an abandoned farmhouse with secrets of its own. Morning arrived with shafts of sunlight streaming through cracks in the bedroom's wooden shutters. Tom awoke stiff and sore from the hard floor, but with a renewed sense of determination. This was his property now, his problem, but also his opportunity. He would approach it systematically, just as he had approached his historical research. After a spare breakfast from his dwindling supplies, Tom began a more methodical exploration of the property. The house, while aesthetically distressed, had a surprisingly solid foundation and frame. Most issues appeared to be cosmetic or related to neglected maintenance. Peeling paint, broken windows, leaking roof in certain sections, outdated or non-functioning utilities. With the right tools and materials, much of this could be addressed by a determined individual willing to learn. Basic repair skills. The barn proved more concerning. One entire wall leaned precariously, threatening collapse. Inside, old farm equipment rusted alongside broken furniture and miscellaneous debris. As Tom cautiously explored the dusty interior, he noticed something unusual about the stone foundation at the rear of the structure. Unlike the rough field stone used for the rest of the foundation, one section appeared to be more carefully constructed, with dressed stones fitted together with precision. Curious, Tom moved closer, brushing away decades of accumulated cobwebs and dust. As he examined the stonework, his historian's eye recognized something that might escape the average observer. The stones were arranged in a pattern that resembled the presidential seal, though stylized and abstracted to remain unobtrusive. This was no random arrangement, but a deliberate construction. Tom's heart quickened. His academic specialty had been presidential history, with particular emphasis on the early Republic period. Could there be some connection to President Monroe? After all, beyond just distant family ownership, the property's location wasn't far from routes that early presidents would have traveled between Washington and their Virginia estates. As he pressed against different sections of the wall, testing for loose stones, Tom was startled when a large central stone shifted under pressure. He pushed harder, and the stone moved inward with surprising ease, revealing a small lever hidden behind it. Historical preservation instincts warred briefly with burning curiosity before the latter won out. Tom pulled the lever. A grinding sound emerged from beneath the barn floor, and a section of seemingly solid earth, approximately 4 feet square, began to sink downward, revealing stone steps descending into darkness. Tom stood frozen in disbelief. Hidden rooms and secret passages weren't uncommon in colonial-era buildings, but something of this scale and sophistication was extraordinary. Tom returned to the house to retrieve his flashlight before cautiously approaching the revealed stairway. The steps descended about 12 feet before opening into a small chamber hewn from the bedrock beneath the barn. The beam of his flashlight revealed walls lined with shelves containing leather-bound volumes, rolled parchments, and wooden boxes. In the center of the room stood a large oak table, its surface covered with a thick layer of dust, but otherwise untouched by time. The air was surprisingly dry for an underground chamber, suggesting some kind of ventilation system. Tom approached the table, where a leather folio lay open to a document written in faded ink. The handwriting was immediately recognizable to someone who had spent years studying presidential documents. It was unmistakably the handwriting of James Monroe, 5th President of the United States. Tom's hands trembled as he carefully examined the document, a letter addressed to a most trusted friend and dated April 18th, 1819. The content was cryptic, but mentioned a secure repository for matters of utmost national secrecy and documents too sensitive for even cabinet knowledge. The letter referenced another location where the complete archive could be found, accessible only by use of the presidential key. Moving methodically around the chamber, Tom examined the shelves. The books appeared to be handwritten ledgers, rather than printed volumes, each labeled with dates and coded designations. One volume labeled J.M. Continental Concerns, 1817-1821, contained what appeared to be records of secret diplomatic communications never included in official archives. Another, Presidential Council, Extraordinary Matters, detailed meetings, and decisions never recorded in any public or previously known private presidential papers. A small wooden chest caught Tom's attention. Unlike the other items in the room, this chest was locked with an unusual mechanism featuring an embedded symbol that matched the stylized presidential seal in the stone wall above. Tom's mind raced with the implications of his discovery. This wasn't merely a private storage space or even a personal archive. This appeared to be an official, yet completely secret, presidential repository. The magnitude of the discovery began to sink in. If authentic, and Tom's trained eye recognized numerous indicators suggesting it was, these documents represented an unprecedented find that could potentially rewrite significant portions of early American history. The implications were staggering. As daylight began to fade, Tom reluctantly climbed back up the stone steps, carefully securing the hidden entrance before returning to the farmhouse. His historian's mind was ablaze with questions. Why was this vault here on a property owned by distant Monroe relatives rather than on Monroe's own estate? Who else knew of its existence? Had the previous owner discovered it, leading to his reported paranoia? And perhaps most importantly, what secrets did it contain that were deemed too sensitive even for cabinet-level knowledge? That night, as Tom lay in his sleeping bag, sleep remained elusive despite his physical exhaustion. His purchase of this dilapidated farm, driven by financial desperation, had led him to what might be the most significant historical discovery of the century. The irony wasn't lost on him. His academic career had been destroyed over allegations of leaking classified presidential documents, and now he had stumbled upon what appeared to be the motherlode of classified presidential secrets from the Republic's early days. As exciting as the discovery was, Tom also recognized the potential danger. If the clerk's cryptic warnings held any truth, others might be interested in the farm's secrets. The previous owner's paranoia about people trying to access something on the property suddenly seemed less like the delusions of an elderly recluse and more like a legitimate concern. Tom needed resources to properly document and preserve his find, but he also needed to proceed cautiously. Who could he trust with knowledge of the vault? How could he protect these priceless historical artifacts while also bringing them to light in a responsible manner? And most immediately pressing, how could he secure the property with his nearly depleted finances? Morning brought no clear answers, but a firm resolve. Tom would begin by thoroughly documenting everything in the vault using his phone's camera. He would need to find work locally to generate income for basic repairs to make the farmhouse livable. Most importantly, he would need to research the property's history more thoroughly to understand the full context of his discovery. After a quick breakfast, Tom returned to the barn, intending to photograph everything in the vault before heading into town to search for employment. As he approached the stone wall with the hidden lever, however, he stopped short. Something was different. The dust on the floor showed signs of disturbance that he hadn't caused, and the stone concealing the lever appeared to have been recently moved. Someone else had been here. Tom's pulse quickened as he scanned the barn's interior. Nothing else seemed obviously disturbed, but the evidence was clear. He wasn't the only person who knew about the vault. The question was whether the intruder had managed to access it or merely discovered the external mechanism. Cautiously, Tom activated the lever. The grinding sound seemed unnaturally loud in the morning quiet as the stone steps were revealed once more. Heart pounding, he descended into the chamber. At first glance, nothing appeared to be missing. The ledgers remained on their shelves, the documents on the central table undisturbed. But as Tom moved deeper into the vault, he noticed something that sent a chill through him. The small wooden chest with the presidential seal was gone. The presidential key, whatever it was, had been taken. Tom stared at the empty spot where the wooden chest had been, a cold sensation spreading through his body. Someone else knew about the vault, someone who had been watching the property, perhaps waiting for the right moment to retrieve this presidential key. The intrusion transformed his incredible historical discovery into something potentially dangerous. He quickly photographed everything remaining in the vault, the ledgers, the documents on the table, the arrangement of the room itself, before returning to the surface and carefully concealing the entrance. Back in the farmhouse, Tom examined the photos, his historian's training allowing him to recognize the significance of what he was seeing. The documents were authentic, not just from their appearance, but from specific content details that would be nearly impossible to fabricate. These weren't just historical curiosities, they contained information about secret presidential decisions and actions never recorded in official archives. One document detailed President Monroe's clandestine negotiations with Spanish officials years before the public announcement of the Monroe Doctrine. Another contained coded correspondence about sensitive continental acquisitions that didn't align with any known territorial expansions from that period. Tom needed more information and better security for the property. With less than $100 to his name, his options were severely limited. First, he needed to understand more about the farm's history and its connection to President Monroe. The County Historical Society would be his first stop, followed by the local library. With his remaining cash, Tom purchased a new padlock for the barn door and basic supplies at Wilson's Hardware in downtown Oakridge. The elderly proprietor, Frank Wilson, watched Tom select the cheapest lock available, along with some bottles of water and non-perishable food. "You the fella who bought Hillcrest Farm?" Frank asked as he rang up the items. "News travels fast," Tom replied with a tight smile. "Small town," Frank shrugged. "That place needs more than a padlock to make it livable." "I'm aware," Tom said. "I'll be addressing the issues one at a time." Frank studied him for a moment. "You know, my grandfather used to talk about Hillcrest, said it wasn't just any farm, said it had importance beyond farming. Never specified what he meant by that. The Monroe connection, most likely." Tom's interest sharpened. Did he mention anything specific about that connection? Nothing clear, just that James Monroe himself visited several times, despite it not being his property, said there were always government men accompanying him, which was unusual for family visits. Frank wrapped the padlock in brown paper. "My grandfather worked construction in the county back in the 1920s, got hired for some project at Hillcrest, something about reinforcing an original structure. Never said exactly what." "The barn, perhaps?" Tom suggested carefully. Frank's eyes narrowed slightly. "Could have been. All I know is it paid unusually well, and afterward he was told never to discuss the specifics of the work." He pushed Tom's purchases across the counter. "That'll be $27.43. Tom paid and gathered his items, mind racing with new information. "Thanks for the history," he said. "Word of advice," Frank added as Tom headed for the door. "There's been folks asking about Hillcrest over the years. Men in suits who don't quite fit in a rural community. If any come around, might be best not to mention what you find on that property." This was the second vague warning Tom had received in less than 24 hours. He nodded his thanks and left, more convinced than ever that the vault was not just historically significant, but potentially dangerous knowledge in the wrong hands. The Westland County Historical Society occupied a restored Victorian house 2 blocks from the courthouse. A bell jingled as Tom entered, and a grey-haired woman looked up from behind a desk piled with archive boxes. "May I help you?" she asked. "I hope so," Tom said. "I recently purchased Hillcrest Farm, and I'm researching its history, particularly its connection to the Monroe family." The woman's expression changed subtly. "I see. I'm Judith Blackwood, the Society's archivist. And you are?" "Thomas Anderson." Recognition flickered in her eyes. "The historian from Capital University, the one who was involved in that classified document situation?" Tom tensed. "I was framed, but yes." To his surprise, Judith nodded, as if this confirmed something. "That would explain why you're here, I suppose. What specifically are you looking for regarding Hillcrest?" "I'd like to understand why a property owned by distant Monroe relatives received multiple visits from President Monroe himself. Also, any information about unusual construction or modifications to the property, particularly the barn, during the 1820s or later renovations in the 1920s. Judith studied him for a long moment before standing. "Follow me." She led Tom to a back room filled with filing cabinets. "Our county records go back to the 1750s, though some are fragmentary. The Monroe connection to Hillcrest is indeed curious. On paper, the property belonged to President Monroe's cousin, Jeremiah Monroe, but there are indications that the actual ownership arrangement was more complex." She pulled out a drawer and extracted a folder. "These are property tax records from 1817 to 1825 during Monroe's presidency. Note that while Jeremiah Monroe is listed as the legal owner, the property taxes were paid directly by the Office of Presidential Affairs, an administrative body that managed certain presidential expenses." Tom examined the records, his excitement growing. "That's highly unusual for a private family property." "Indeed. And here," she pulled another file, "are construction records from 1819, a significant project at Hillcrest, commissioned directly by the White House, not by Jeremiah Monroe. The details are vague, mentioning only essential improvements to existing structures with no specific blueprints or plans." "What about the 1920s renovations?" Tom asked. Judith hesitated. "Those records are less complete. There was a fire at the county records office in 1931 that destroyed many documents from that period. However," she unlocked a cabinet and withdrew a thin folder. "These survived. They indicate that in 1926 the War Department, not the farm's owner at that time, commissioned work at Hillcrest for strategic historical preservation." Tom's historian instincts went on high alert. The War Department had no official role in historical preservation. "Precisely," Judith said. "Whatever they were preserving was of military or security interest, not merely historical significance." She studied Tom carefully. "Mr. Anderson, have you found something at Hillcrest? Something unusual?" Tom weighed his options. Judith seemed knowledgeable and potentially sympathetic, but he'd learned the hard way that trust could be misplaced. "I'm still exploring the property," he said neutrally. "It's in worse condition than I expected." Judith didn't push. "Well, if you have further questions about the historical records, I'm here Wednesday through Saturday." She closed the folders but didn't immediately return them to their cabinets. "One more thing you might find interesting. In 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was unusual activity reported at Hillcrest. Several local residents observed government vehicles at the property for 3 consecutive nights. The farm's owner at that time was instructed to vacate the premises temporarily, with generous compensation for his inconvenience." "During a nuclear standoff with the Soviets?" Tom asked. "That can't be coincidence." "I don't believe in Coincidences when it comes to patterns spanning centuries, Judith replied. Whatever Hillcrest's significance, it has periodically been of interest to the highest levels of government since Monroe's presidency, particularly during times of national crisis. Tom left the Historical Society with photocopies of the key documents and a deepening sense that he had stumbled onto something far more significant than a simple historical archive. The documents in the vault, the recurring government interest, the missing presidential key, all suggested a system of secret presidential knowledge deliberately kept outside official channels, accessible only to sitting presidents during moments of national emergency. As he drove back to the farm, Tom noticed a black SUV with government plates parked near the property entrance. His heart rate accelerated as he pulled into the long driveway. A man in a dark suit stood near the farmhouse, examining the exterior. When he spotted Tom's approaching car, he straightened and adjusted his tie. Tom parked and stepped out cautiously. "Can I help you?" he called. The man approached with a confident stride. "Mr. Anderson, Richard Hayes, Department of Historical Preservation." He extended a hand which Tom shook reluctantly. "We were notified of the property transfer and wanted to check in, given Hillcrest's historical significance." "I wasn't aware the government monitored private property sales," Tom said. Hayes smiled thinly. "Only those on our registry of historically sensitive sites. Hillcrest has been on that list since 1819. "That's interesting," Tom replied. "I visited the County Historical Society today, and they mentioned unusual government interest in the property, but nothing about an official registry." Something flickered in Hayes's eyes. "The registry isn't public knowledge, it's an internal classification. For a dilapidated farm with a distant connection to President Monroe," Tom challenged. "Seems excessive." Hayes glanced toward the barn, then back to Tom. "Many historical sites appear unremarkable to the casual observer. May I ask what prompted your purchase of Hillcrest? Your background is in presidential history, not historical preservation or architecture." The fact that Hayes knew his academic specialty confirmed Tom's suspicions. This was no routine check on a historical property. "I needed an affordable place to live after my career was derailed," Tom said. "The price was right." "Of course," Hayes nodded, though his expression suggested he didn't believe this was the full story. "Well, should you encounter anything of historical significance during your renovation, documents, artifacts, unusual structural features, we'd appreciate being notified." He handed Tom a business card. "Directly to me, if possible, rather than local authorities or historical societies." "I'll keep that in mind," Tom said non-committally. Hayes surveyed the property once more. "One final thing, Mr. Anderson. Given your recent difficulties regarding classified presidential documents, I feel obligated to mention that any historical materials found on government-monitored properties like Hillcrest are subject to national security review before public disclosure. I'm sure you understand the sensitivity." The thinly veiled threat wasn't lost on Tom. "I understand perfectly how the government responds to information it wants to control," he replied evenly. Hayes smiled without warmth. "I'm glad we understand each other. Good day, Mr. Anderson." As the black SUV disappeared down the driveway, Tom realized his situation had become substantially more complicated. Hayes's visit confirmed that whatever lay hidden at Hillcrest was still of active interest to the federal government. They would be watching, perhaps more closely now that a disgraced presidential historian had acquired the property. Tom hurried to the barn, relieved to find the hidden entrance still concealed and undisturbed. Hayes had clearly been interested in the barn, but hadn't discovered the mechanism. That small advantage wouldn't last long if they decided to conduct a more thorough investigation. Back in the farmhouse, Tom spread out his research materials on the dusty dining room table. The evidence painted an extraordinary picture. A secret presidential facility established during Monroe's administration, maintained for over 2 centuries, and accessed periodically during moments of national crisis. The missing presidential key was clearly significant, perhaps literally a key to another location, or metaphorically, a code or cipher needed to access the complete archive mentioned in Monroe's letter. As evening approached, Tom became aware of a vehicle coming up the driveway. His first thought was that Hayes had returned, perhaps with a search warrant this time. Instead, a mud-splattered pickup truck came into view. A woman in her 30s, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, stepped out, dressed in work clothes and boots. Tom met her on the porch, wary of more unexpected visitors. "Evening," she called as she approached. "Elizabeth Carpenter. I own the neighboring farm to the east." She gestured toward a distant tree line. "Thought I should introduce myself and see if you need anything. Hillcrest hasn't had a proper owner in some time." "Thomas Anderson," Tom replied, shaking her offered hand. "Just getting settled in. It needs work, obviously." Elizabeth surveyed the dilapidated farmhouse and leaning barn with a practiced eye. "That's putting it mildly. You planning to farm the land or just live in the house?" "Haven't decided yet," Tom said. "I'm still assessing what's salvageable." "Well, if you need to borrow tools or want advice on local contractors who won't rob you blind, let me know." She paused. "I noticed you had a visitor earlier. Government type." Tom studied her, trying to determine if there was more to her neighborly visit. "Yes. Apparently Hillcrest is on some historical registry." Elizabeth snorted. "That's what they always say. Been saying it for generations whenever they show up here." "They've been coming here regularly?" Tom asked. "Like clockwork, every few years. My grandfather used to talk about it. Government men checking on Hillcrest, especially during national emergencies. Cuban Missile Crisis, Watergate, 9/11. Each time, black cars would appear at Hillcrest for a day or two." She tilted her head, studying Tom with newfound interest. "You really didn't know what you were buying, did you?" "I knew it needed work and fit my budget," Tom said cautiously. Elizabeth laughed. "Well, you got more than you bargained for, I expect. Old Mr. Hargrove, the last owner, he found something on the property. Never said exactly what, but it changed. Him started talking about presidential secrets and national security. Most folks thought he'd gone senile, but then the government men started visiting more frequently." "What happened to him?" Tom asked. "Official story is he died of a heart attack, found in the barn." Elizabeth's expression darkened. "My father helped the sheriff's deputy who discovered the body. Said it didn't look like any heart attack he'd ever seen, too neat somehow." Tom felt a chill. "Are you suggesting he was killed?" Elizabeth shrugged. "I'm not suggesting anything except that Hillcrest has always been more than just a rundown farm, and people who dig too deep tend to attract unwanted attention." She glanced at the darkening sky. "I should get back before I lose daylight. My number's on the community bulletin board at Wilson's Hardware if you need anything." As she turned to leave, Tom made a split-second decision. "Elizabeth, do you know anything about a presidential key?" She froze momentarily before turning back. "Where did you hear that phrase?" "I found some old documents in the house," Tom said, not entirely lying. "They mentioned a presidential key in connection with an archive." Elizabeth glanced around as if checking whether they might be overheard. "My grandfather mentioned it once. Said it was the reason the government men came. To use something called the presidential key during emergencies. He never knew what it was exactly, just that it was important enough to bring officials from Washington at moments of crisis." She studied Tom intently. "If you found something about it, be careful who you tell. That's not the kind of information people are allowed to have." After Elizabeth left, Tom returned to the dining room table, adding this new information to his growing understanding. The presidential key wasn't just historically significant, it was apparently still actively used by the government during crises. Its recent theft from the vault suggested someone wanted to access whatever presidential secrets it unlocked, possibly the complete archive mentioned in Monroe's letter. Tom needed allies, people with resources and knowledge who could help him understand what he'd discovered and protect it from those who would exploit or bury it. His academic reputation was destroyed, but there were still individuals who might take his findings seriously. One name came to mind: Dr. James Mitchell, his former doctoral advisor and one of the few historians with appropriate security clearance to access classified presidential materials. Mitchell had publicly defended Tom during the scandal, though it had cost him politically within the university. If anyone would believe Tom's discovery and understand its significance, it would be Mitchell. Tom used his phone to send a carefully worded email to Mitchell's personal account, requesting a meeting about a significant historical discovery with national security implications. He avoided specifics, aware that his communications might be monitored now that Hayes knew where he was. That night, Tom slept fitfully in his sleeping bag, waking at every creak and groan of the old farmhouse. The weight of what he'd discovered and what had been stolen pressed on him. He was caught between powerful forces. Whoever had taken the presidential key, the government officials clearly monitoring the property, and his own desperate need for vindication after his unjust academic disgrace. Morning brought a response from Mitchell. Intrigued by your message. Cannot meet at your location due to commitments. Can you come to Richmond this afternoon? Faculty Club, 2 p.m. It was brief and non-committal, but it was a start. Tom spent the morning installing his new padlock on the barn door, a woefully inadequate security measure for what lay beneath, but the only option with his limited resources. He also thoroughly photographed the farm's exterior and interior, establishing a visual record of its current condition in case of unauthorized entry or tampering during his absence. Before leaving for Richmond, Tom returned to the vault, carefully examining the remaining documents for any clue about where the complete archive might be located or what the presidential key might unlock. One document caught his attention, a coded letter that appeared to use a book cipher with numbers indicating page, line, and word positions. Without the reference book, he couldn't decode it, but it suggested that important information was deliberately concealed, even within the vault itself. The drive to Richmond took just over an hour. The University Faculty Club was housed in a stately brick building near campus, its interior featuring dark wood paneling and leather furniture that spoke of academic tradition and privilege. Tom felt acutely out of place in his rumpled clothes. As he approached the receptionist, "I'm meeting Dr. Mitchell," he said. "Thomas Anderson." The receptionist's professional smile faltered slightly at his name, another reminder of his notoriety in academic circles, but she directed him to a private meeting room at the back of the club. Mitchell was already there, silver-haired and distinguished in a tweed jacket, looking much as he had when Tom studied under him years ago. "Tom," Mitchell said, rising to shake his hand firmly. "You're looking weathered." "That's a kind way of putting it," Tom replied with a wry smile. Mitchell gestured to a chair. "Your email was intriguingly vague. What's this discovery with national security implications?" Tom took a deep breath. "I recently purchased a property called Hillcrest Farm in Westland County. It has a historical connection to President Monroe, though not the one publicly recorded." He paused. "I found a hidden vault beneath the barn containing presidential documents never included in official archives. Documents suggesting a parallel system of presidential knowledge and decision-making dating back to Monroe's administration." Mitchell's expression remained neutral, but his eyes sharpened. "That's an extraordinary claim, Tom, especially coming from someone in your current position." "I'm aware of the irony," Tom acknowledged. My academic career was destroyed over allegedly leaking classified presidential documents, and now I've stumbled upon what might be the most classified presidential archive in existence. What evidence do you have? Mitchell asked. Tom placed his phone on the table, open to the photos he'd taken in the vault. These are authentic, as you can see from the handwriting, paper composition, and content details that would be nearly impossible to fabricate. Mitchell examined the photos carefully, his professional detachment giving way to visible surprise as he swiped through them. This appears to be Monroe's handwriting, and these references to cabinet meetings in 1819. He looked up at Tom. If these are authentic, they contradict significant aspects of our understanding of early presidential history. They're authentic, Tom confirmed. And there's more. The vault was created during Monroe's presidency, but has been actively maintained and apparently accessed by subsequent administrations during national crises. A government agent named Richard Hayes, claiming to be from the Department of Historical Preservation, visited the property yesterday, clearly aware of its significance. According to my neighbor, government officials have visited Hillcrest during major national emergencies throughout the past century. Mitchell sat back, processing this information. This would explain certain historical anomalies, decisions, or information presidents shouldn't have had access to through official channels. He studied Tom carefully. What's your plan here, Tom? Publication, vindication. I'm not sure yet, Tom admitted. When I discovered the vault, it had already been partially compromised. Something called the presidential key was stolen just before I took ownership. According to Monroe's documents, this key provides access to a complete archive in another location. I need to understand what I've stumbled into before deciding how to proceed. Mitchell's expression grew grave. If what you're describing is real, a parallel system of presidential knowledge and power operating outside official channels for 2 centuries, there are people who would go to extraordinary lengths to keep it secret. I've gathered that impression, Tom said dryly. I've received warnings from the county clerk, the local hardware store owner, and my neighbor. The previous owner of the farm died under suspicious circumstances after apparently discovering something on the property. Yet you came to me, Mitchell noted. Why? Because I need someone with credibility and connections who can help me understand and protect what I've found. Someone who knows how to navigate the intersection of historical research and national security. And someone who didn't believe I was guilty of leaking classified information. Mitchell was silent for a long moment. I have contacts who might be able to authenticate these documents definitively and help determine their significance. But Tom, he leaned forward, if this is what it appears to be, you've placed yourself at the center of something extraordinarily dangerous. Not just politically sensitive, but potentially life-threatening. I don't have much left to lose, Tom said. My reputation is destroyed, my career is over, my marriage has ended. Finding this vault feels like purpose, a chance to uncover historical truth and perhaps restore some portion of my credibility in the process. Or a chance to disappear like the previous owner of Hillcrest, Mitchell countered. Nevertheless, I'll help. Send these photos to my secure email, not my university account. I'll have my contacts examine them discreetly. In the meantime, document everything thoroughly and create secure backups of your evidence. Trust no one else with this information, not even local authorities. Tom nodded. There's one more thing. The coded letter suggests there might be additional information hidden within the documents themselves. Do you know any cryptography experts who could assist without needing to know the source? As it happens, I do, Mitchell said, a former student who now works in information security. I'll make arrangements. He checked his watch. I need to be at a faculty meeting in 15 minutes. Keep a low profile, Tom. I'll be in touch within 48 hours. As they parted, Mitchell added, "Be careful at Hillcrest. If this is as significant as it appears, you may already be under surveillance." The warning proved prescient. As Tom drove back to Oakridge, he noticed a dark sedan maintaining a consistent distance behind him. When he took an unnecessary detour through a residential neighborhood, the sedan followed. Only when Tom pulled into the parking lot of the local police station did the vehicle continue past, confirming his suspicion that he was being tailed. By the time Tom returned to Hillcrest, the sun was setting. He approached the farm cautiously, looking for signs of intrusion. The new padlock on the barn remained intact, but something felt wrong. Parking his car, Tom carefully examined the farmhouse exterior before entering. His instincts were correct. The front door, which he had pulled firmly shut when leaving, was now slightly ajar. Someone had been inside during his absence. Tom hesitated, considering whether to retreat and call the police. But what would he tell them? That someone had entered his unlocked, dilapidated farmhouse, that he suspected government agents were monitoring him because of a secret presidential vault. He would sound delusional. Instead, Tom entered cautiously, flipping on his flashlight to examine the interior. Nothing seemed obviously disturbed in the main rooms, but when he reached the dining room where he'd left his research materials, he discovered they had been meticulously searched. The papers appeared to be in the same positions, but subtle signs, the alignment of pages, the arrangement of folders, told him someone had examined everything. A wave of cold dread washed over him. Whoever had been here was professional enough to minimize evidence of their intrusion. They knew what they were looking for, and they knew how to search without leaving obvious traces. Most concerningly, they now knew exactly what Tom had discovered and what he had learned from his research at the Historical Society. Tom checked his sleeping bag and personal belongings next. His laptop, an older model he used mainly for writing, was still there, but the position of the lid indicated it had been opened. Any electronic files would have been compromised. His duffel bag of clothing had been searched as well, the items impeccably replaced, but in subtly different arrangements. The violation of his meager possessions and research materials left Tom feeling exposed and vulnerable. It was one thing to suspect government interest in Hillcrest. It was another to have concrete evidence that unknown individuals felt entitled to enter his home and search his belongings without warrant or warning. Tom sat on the dusty sofa, considering his options. He could abandon the farm and flee, but where would he go? His funds were nearly depleted, and running would only reinforce the perception that he was engaged in something illicit. He could confront Hayes, the supposed historical preservation agent, but that would reveal his awareness of the surveillance and potentially escalate the situation. As darkness fell completely, Tom reached a decision. He would continue his investigation, but with greater caution and deliberate misdirection. He would create visible research materials focused on innocuous aspects of the farm's history while keeping his real findings secure elsewhere. He would establish predictable patterns to make surveillance easier while conducting his actual investigation during moments when he could reasonably ensure privacy. Most importantly, he needed to determine what the presidential key unlocked and who had taken it. If the key accessed a complete archive of presidential secrets, as Monroe's letter suggested, its holder potentially possessed information of extraordinary historical and political significance, information that could threaten national security or upend established historical narratives about presidential decision-making. Tom remembered Elizabeth Carpenter's comment about government officials visiting Hillcrest during national crises throughout the past century. If true, this suggested the vault and whatever it connected to remained actively used by modern presidents, not just as a historical artifact, but as an ongoing system of executive knowledge and power outside constitutional constraints or congressional oversight. The implications were staggering. What decisions had been made, what actions taken, based on information and authorities kept hidden from the American people and their elected representatives. And who else knew about this system besides those directly authorized to access it? As Tom considered these questions, he heard a vehicle approaching, the distinctive sound of Elizabeth Carpenter's pickup truck. She had returned, and at this late hour, it was unlikely to be a casual neighborly visit. Tom stepped onto the porch just as she pulled up in front of the farmhouse, her headlights illuminating the facade before she cut the engine. "Sorry to disturb you so late," she said as she approached, her expression tense. "But I saw something I thought you should know about. There were men on your property while you were gone today. Men with equipment, checking the barn." "Government men?" Tom asked. "I don't think so," Elizabeth replied. "They didn't have government vehicles, and they were trying to be discreet. When I drove by and slowed down, they acted like they were just lost travelers consulting a map." She frowned. "But they had what?" "Looked like ground-penetrating radar equipment, partially covered in the back of their van." Tom's concern deepened. "Did they go inside the barn?" "They were working on the padlock when I passed by the first time. When I circled back 20 minutes later, they were gone." Elizabeth studied him intently. "I think you've kicked a hornet's nest, Mr. Anderson. Between the government agent yesterday and these men today, whatever's at Hillcrest has multiple parties very interested." "Thank you for telling me," Tom said sincerely. Elizabeth hesitated. "Look, I don't know what's going on here, but my family has lived next to Hillcrest for generations. My grandfather always said there was something important hidden here, something presidents needed during America's darkest hours. If you found it, you need to be careful who you tell and who you trust." She turned to leave, then added, "Including me." As Elizabeth drove away, Tom realized the situation was escalating beyond his ability to manage alone. Someone had stolen the presidential key shortly before he purchased the property. Government officials were monitoring him. Now, an unknown third party was conducting ground surveys of the barn area. Whatever secrets lay hidden at Hillcrest, multiple factions were converging to uncover them. Tom returned to the house, more determined than ever to understand what he had stumbled into. If he was going to protect himself and the historical truth, he needed to move faster than those pursuing him. The presidential key was the central mystery. What it unlocked, where it led, and who now possessed it would determine not just his fate, but potentially reveal a hidden dimension of American presidential power that had operated in the shadows for over 2 centuries. With renewed purpose, Tom returned to the documents he had photographed from the vault. Somewhere within them must be clues about the key's purpose and the location of the complete archive it accessed. As a presidential historian, Tom had spent his career piecing together narratives from fragmentary evidence. Now, with his reputation and possibly his life at stake, he would need to apply those skills to the most important historical puzzle he had ever encountered. The next morning, Tom rose before dawn, his mind still processing the events of the previous day. The barn had been compromised during his absence. Elizabeth had reported strangers with scanning equipment, and his own house had been searched. Whoever had taken the presidential key clearly wasn't satisfied. They were looking for something more. Tom started a small fire in the ancient kitchen stove, using wood gathered from the property. As he boiled water for instant coffee in his only usable pot, he reviewed his situation. He had less than $50 remaining, a compromised property, and powerful unknown entities converging on Hillcrest Farm. His only allies were a skeptical academic mentor, a cautious but seemingly helpful neighbor, and a county archivist, who might or might not be trustworthy. After his meager breakfast, Tom returned to the vault, concerned about its security. The entrance mechanism, while cleverly concealed, was ultimately mechanical and could be discovered by determined searchers. With the right equipment, He needed to remove the most critical documents to a safer location before they were found or confiscated. Inside the vault, Tom carefully selected the most important items. The letter from President Monroe, mentioning the complete archive. The ledger detailing unofficial presidential decisions and several coded documents that might reveal the location of whatever the presidential key unlocked. These he placed in a waterproof document case he'd purchased at Wilson's Hardware, which he then secured in a hidden compartment he'd discovered beneath a loose floorboard in the master bedroom. As he finished concealing his discovery, Tom heard the sound of an approaching vehicle. Peering cautiously through a grimy window, he observed a county sheriff's cruiser pulling into the driveway. This was a complication he hadn't anticipated. The sheriff was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a weathered face and calculating eyes. His nameplate identified him as Sheriff Lawson. He looked around the property with the practiced gaze of someone accustomed to noticing details before approaching the house. "Mr. Anderson," he called. "Sheriff Lawson, mind if I have a word?" Tom opened the door, projecting a calm he didn't feel. "Good morning, Sheriff. What can I do for you?" "Just making a courtesy call," Lawson said, though his expression suggested otherwise. "We like to check in when someone new moves into the county, especially in remote properties like this one." His eyes scanned what was visible of the interior. "Getting settled in okay?" "As well as can be expected," Tom replied. "It needs work, obviously." "Obviously," Lawson agreed. "Mind if I come in? Been a while since anyone's been inside Hillcrest." Though phrased as a request, Tom sensed it wasn't optional. He stepped aside to allow the sheriff entry, watching carefully as the man surveyed the dilapidated interior. "You know," Lawson said conversationally, "Hillcrest has an interesting history in this county. Old Mr. Hargrove, the previous owner, was found dead in that barn. I was the responding officer." "I heard it was a heart attack," Tom said carefully. Lawson's eyes narrowed slightly. "That was the official finding, yes. But Hargrove had been acting strangely for weeks before his death, paranoid, claiming people were watching the property, trying to get access to something hidden here." He studied Tom's reaction. "Sound familiar?" "I've only been here a few days," Tom deflected. "Haven't noticed anything unusual apart from the expected challenges of an abandoned property." "That's so?" Lawson walked to the dining room, noting the research materials on the table. "Doing some history work?" "I'm a historian by training," Tom said, naturally curious about the property's past. Lawson picked up a photocopy of the tax records Tom had obtained from the Historical Society. "Monroe connection, right? That's what everyone focuses on." He replaced the document. "Curious thing, though, Hillcrest has had an unusual pattern of official interest over the years. Government vehicles, men in suits asking questions in town. Even had some Homeland Security types sniffing around after 9/11, if you can believe that." "Hard to imagine why they'd be interested in a rundown farm," Tom offered. "That's just it," Lawson said, turning to face Tom directly. "Unless there's something here that doesn't appear on any property records. Something worth monitoring and protecting." His voice hardened slightly. "Something worth killing for." The implication hung in the air between them. Tom maintained his neutral expression, though internally his mind raced. Was Lawson suggesting Hargrove had been murdered? And if so, was he warning Tom or threatening him? "I can't imagine what that would be," Tom said carefully. Lawson smiled without warmth. "Mr. Anderson, we may be a small county, but we're not uninformed. I know who you are, the historian accused of leaking classified presidential documents. Now you've purchased a property with documented presidential connections and a history of high-level government interest. That's quite a coincidence." "Sometimes coincidences happen," Tom replied. "I needed an affordable place to live after my career imploded. And you just happened to choose the one property in the county with historical presidential significance?" Lawson shook his head. "I don't believe in coincidences that convenient." He moved toward the door. "Just so we understand each other, Mr. Anderson, my job is to maintain order and safety in this county. If your presence at Hillcrest creates problems or attracts the wrong kind of attention, I'll be paying you another visit." "Is that a threat, Sheriff?" Tom asked quietly. "Just an observation," Lawson replied. "Oh, and one more thing. I saw you met Richard Hayes yesterday. Interesting fellow, Hayes. Been coming to Westland County periodically for years, always checking on Hillcrest. Claims to be from different government departments each time. Historical preservation yesterday, Homeland Security before that, State Department before that. Makes you wonder who he really works for, doesn't it?" With that parting comment, Lawson departed, leaving Tom with yet another piece of the increasingly complex puzzle surrounding Hillcrest Farm. The sheriff clearly knew more than he was saying. About Hargrove's death, about Hayes, and possibly about whatever was hidden at Hillcrest. But whether he was an ally, a threat, or simply a cautious local official remained unclear. Tom spent the rest of the morning examining the vault documents he'd photographed, searching for clues about the presidential key and the complete archive it supposedly accessed. The reference system used in the ledgers was complex, a combination of dates, locations, and coded designations that seemed designed to obscure the specific nature of the decisions and actions being recorded. One entry caught his attention. July 4th, 1824. Contingency repository activated in accordance with Presidential Directive 1A. Materials from Monticello secured and protocols established for succession. TJ provisions executed as specified. In final instructions. Tom stared at the entry, pulse quickening. Thomas Jefferson had died on July 4th, 1826, not 1824. But Jefferson had been seriously ill for years before his death. Was it possible that certain sensitive materials from Monticello had been removed and secured while Jefferson was still alive? The timing suggested a deliberate transfer of secret information or artifacts from one former president to a secure repository, possibly the complete archive mentioned in Monroe's letter. Another entry reinforced this theory. October 28, 1825, Presidential Directive 3C implemented. Key transferred to JQA, following protocol established by GW, original repository secured. Secondary access limited to emergency circumstances as defined in contingency documents. JQA would be John Quincy Adams, who succeeded Monroe as president in 1825. GW was clearly George Washington. The entry suggested a systematic transfer of both the presidential key and access protocols from one administration to the next. Dating back to Washington himself, this was astonishing. Evidence of a secret system of presidential knowledge and authority dating to the very beginning of the Republic, transferred outside official channels, known only to presidents and perhaps a small circle of trusted officials. But what information was contained in this parallel system, and why was it kept separate from constitutional governance? As Tom pondered these questions, his phone chimed with an email notification. Dr. Mitchell had responded much sooner than expected. Tom, preliminary analysis confirms authenticity of documents. Handwriting, paper composition, and content details align with known samples from Monroe's administration. My contact in document authentication is both intrigued and concerned by what you've discovered. We need to meet again immediately, but not at the faculty club. Too many eyes. Come to this address in Richmond at 7 p.m. tonight, 1824 Chestnut Street, rear entrance. Bring all your evidence. J.M. The urgency of Mitchell's message and the request to bring all evidence suggested he had learned something significant. Tom would need to carefully select which original documents to take and which to leave securely hidden at Hillcrest. He couldn't risk the entire collection being seized or compromised. Tom was preparing his materials for the trip to Richmond when he heard another vehicle approaching. Tensing, he moved to the window, expecting to see Hayes or perhaps Sheriff Lawson returning. Instead, a battered blue sedan parked beside the house, and an elderly man Tom didn't recognize emerged slowly, leaning heavily on a cane. The visitor was in his late 70s or early 80s, thin but dignified in dated but well-maintained clothing. He stood for a moment, surveying the property with a look of profound recognition, before moving toward the house with measured steps. Tom opened the door before the man could knock. "Can I help you?" The elderly man studied Tom with keen eyes that belied his age. "Thomas Anderson. My name is Walter Hargrove. My father owned this property before his passing." Tom's interest sharpened immediately. "Please come in, Mr. Hargrove." Walter entered, his eyes taking in the dilapidated interior with a mixture of sadness and familiarity. "It's been some time since I've been inside Hillcrest. Not since they found my father." He moved to a chair in the parlor, lowering himself carefully. "I understand you're a historian with an interest in presidential history. News does travel fast around here," Tom commented, taking a seat opposite his visitor. "In a community this size, there are few secrets," Walter replied, "except, of course, for the ones buried deep." He fixed Tom with a penetrating gaze. "Have you found it yet?" The directness of the question caught Tom off guard. "Found what exactly?" Walter smiled faintly. "Please, Mr. Anderson, I'm an old man with limited time and energy. Let's not engage in unnecessary evasions. My father discovered something beneath the barn, something connected to President Monroe and subsequent administrations. I believe you've found it too." Tom studied Walter carefully, weighing his options. The man was Hargrove's son, which suggested he might have information about what his father had discovered before his death. But trusting anyone at this point carried significant risks. "Why are you here, Mr. Hargrove?" Tom asked. "To warn you," Walter replied simply, "and perhaps to help if you're receptive. My father was not the first owner of Hillcrest to die under suspicious circumstances after discovering its secrets. There's a pattern stretching back generations. Those who find what's hidden here and attempt to reveal it rarely survive the effort." "Are you suggesting your father was murdered?" Tom asked. Walter's expression hardened. "I'm certain of it. The official cause was heart failure, but my father had no history of cardiac issues. What he did have was a discovery he was increasingly agitated about, something he called the presidential vault, that contained evidence of actions and decisions made outside constitutional authority." "If you knew about this, why didn't you come forward after his death?" Tom asked. "Who says I didn't?" Walter countered. "I spoke with Sheriff Lawson, with the county medical examiner, even attempted to contact federal authorities. The response was uniform, polite dismissal, followed by subtle but unmistakable warnings to drop the matter. After the third accident nearly claimed my life, I got the message." He leaned forward. "Whatever is hidden at Hillcrest, Mr. Anderson, powerful people want it to remain hidden." Tom considered his next words carefully. "I may have found something in the barn. A hidden chamber with documents from Monroe's administration, suggesting a secret system of presidential knowledge transferred outside official channels." Walter nodded, unsurprised. "Yes, that aligns with what my father described before his death, but he also mentioned something else, a key of some kind that unlocked a second, more significant location." "The presidential key," Tom confirmed. "It was stolen shortly before I purchased the property." Walter frowned. Then whoever took it likely knows where the main repository is located. My father believed the vault here was merely an antechamber, a secure location for certain documents, but not the principal archive. According to what he learned, the complete collection is hidden elsewhere, accessible only with the presidential key. Did he discover where? Tom asked eagerly. If he did, he never told me directly, Walter replied. But in the weeks before his death, he became obsessed with the history of Fort Monroe in Hampton. He made several trips there, returning increasingly agitated each time. His last coherent statement to me was that the original fortress holds the complete truth, a presidential inheritance never meant for public knowledge. Fort Monroe, one of the oldest continuously operated military installations in the United States, dating back to 1819 during President Monroe's administration. Its historical connection to the president whose name it bore could hardly be coincidental. Did your father have the presidential key? Tom asked. Walter shook his head. He was searching for it. He believed it had been removed from Hillcrest decades earlier, possibly during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when government officials evacuated the previous owner and occupied the property for several days. My father thought whatever they removed then was the key itself, but he was convinced it had been returned to the area more recently. Why would they return it? Tom wondered aloud. He never explained that part clearly. Something about the system breaking down and protocols being violated. In his final weeks, he spoke increasingly about constitutional crises and the danger of concentrated executive power. Walter's expression grew distant. I dismissed much of it as paranoia at the time. After his death, I reconsidered. Tom processed this new information. If Hargrove had been investigating Fort Monroe before his death, perhaps that's where the complete archive was located. But accessing it would require the presidential key, now in unknown hands. Mr. Hargrove, Tom said carefully, do you have any idea who might have taken the key? The elderly man's expression darkened. There are several possibilities, none of them reassuring. Various government agencies have maintained interest in Hillcrest over the decades. The Secret Service, elements within the State Department, specialized units of military intelligence. But my father became convinced that another group was also monitoring the property. Individuals he described as constitutional originalists, who believed the secret presidential system represented a dangerous corruption of the founder's intent. Like a militia or patriot group, Tom asked. More sophisticated than that, Walter replied. My father believed they included historians, legal scholars, even former government officials who had learned about the secret system and opposed its very existence. He called them the Guardians, and thought they might seek to expose or destroy the archive rather than allow it to continue operating outside constitutional constraints. This added yet another layer of complexity to Tom's situation. Not only might he be caught between rival government factions, but also ideological opponents of the entire secret system. Opponents who might be equally dangerous to anyone who discovered its existence. Why are you telling me all this? Tom asked finally. Walter studied him for a long moment. Because my father died trying to understand what's hidden here, and I believe you might succeed where he failed. Not because you're smarter or more determined, but because you have nothing left to lose. Your academic reputation is destroyed, your career ended. In intelligence work, they call people in your position burned assets. Dangerous because they no longer fear conventional consequences. The assessment was uncomfortably accurate. Tom's professional disgrace had indeed freed him from many of the constraints that might have limited his investigation under normal circumstances. There's one more thing you should know, Walter added, rising with effort from his chair. The presidential key isn't just a physical key, at least not according to my father's research. It's a combination of elements, a physical object, yes, but also a code book or cipher key that allows for the interpretation of the archived materials. Without both components, the archive remains indecipherable even if located. Tom escorted Walter to the door, his mind racing with implications. "Thank you for the information, Mr. Hargrove. I'm sorry about your father." Walter paused at the threshold. "Be careful, Mr. Anderson. Whatever is hidden in that archive has remained secret through nearly 40 presidencies for a reason. My father used to say, some secrets are kept not because they'd endanger the nation, but because they'd shatter our understanding of it." I fear he was right. After Walter departed, Tom returned to his research materials with renewed focus. Fort Monroe was a promising lead. A fortification with direct connections to President Monroe, sufficient security for a clandestine archive, and continuous government control since its construction. If the complete archive was indeed hidden, somewhere within the fort's massive stone walls, accessing it would require both the stolen presidential key and whatever cipher system accompanied it. Tom packed essential documents and his research notes for his meeting with Mitchell in Richmond. As a precaution, he created digital copies of everything, encrypting them and storing them in multiple cloud locations, accessible with different passwords. If anything happened to him or his physical evidence, at least some record of his discoveries would survive. The drive to Richmond was tense, with Tom constantly checking his rearview mirror for signs of surveillance. He took an indirect route, making several unnecessary turns and doubling back occasionally to identify any vehicles that might be following him. Whether due to his precautions or sheer luck, he noticed no obvious tail as he approached the address Mitchell had provided. 1824. Chestnut Street proved to be a modest townhouse in an older section of Richmond, the kind of nondescript residence that attracted little attention. Following Mitchell's instructions, Tom parked a block away and approached. The rear entrance on foot, document case clutched tightly under his arm. Mitchell answered his knock immediately, looking more disheveled than during their meeting at the faculty club. He ushered Tom inside without greeting, securing multiple locks on the door before leading him to a small study lined with bookshelves. "Were you followed?" Mitchell asked, drawing the curtains closed. "Not that I could detect," Tom replied. "What's going on, James? Your message seemed urgent." Mitchell gestured to a stack of folders on his desk. "My contact confirmed the authenticity of your documents, not just technically, but contextually. The references to cabinet meetings and diplomatic communications align with known historical events, but include details never publicly disclosed." He fixed Tom with an intense gaze. "Do you understand what that means? These are genuine presidential records, kept outside the official documentary record of the United States government." "I gathered that," Tom said. "But why? What purpose would a parallel presidential archive serve?" Mitchell sat heavily in his desk chair. "That's what's been keeping me awake. I have a theory based on when this system appears to have been established. During Monroe's administration, with apparent connections back to Washington and Jefferson." He leaned forward. "What if, Tom, the early presidents created a mechanism for certain types of executive actions that they believed necessary, but potentially constitutionally questionable? A system of presidential authority exercised in extraordinary circumstances, documented but kept separate from official channels, to avoid constitutional challenges?" The implication was staggering. "You're suggesting a deliberate end run around constitutional constraints, created by the very people who established those constraints." "Not exactly," Mitchell clarified. "More like a recognition that certain presidential actions might be necessary in crisis situations where the full constitutional process would be too slow or too public. The early republic was fragile, surrounded by powerful enemies. Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. They'd all witnessed how quickly revolution could turn to chaos or tyranny. They might have created this system as a safeguard, a way for presidents to take extraordinary actions when necessary while keeping the constitutional system intact for normal governance. Tom considered this theory. So the vault at Hillcrest would be what? A way station? A secure location for documentation that would eventually be transferred to the main archive? Precisely, Mitchell nodded. A temporary holding facility known only to a select few, used to document presidential decisions and actions that couldn't be recorded in official archives without raising uncomfortable constitutional questions. Tom shared Walter Hargrove's information about Fort Monroe and his father's investigation before his death. Mitchell listened with growing concern. Fort Monroe would be a logical location, he agreed. Constructed during Monroe's presidency, continuously under federal control, secure facilities that could be restricted even within an already secure military installation. He frowned. But accessing any archive there would be extraordinarily difficult without official authorization, which is why the presidential key is so important, Tom concluded. Whoever has it potentially has access to 2 centuries of secret presidential actions and decisions, information that could rewrite our understanding of American history and executive power. Mitchell's expression grew grave. And possibly destabilize our entire system of government if released indiscriminately. Imagine the public reaction to learning that from Washington onward, presidents have maintained a secret system of executive action outside constitutional constraints. It could undermine the legitimacy of the presidency itself, regardless of which party holds the office. This perspective gave Tom pause. As a historian, he valued truth and transparency, but he also understood the potential consequences of destabilizing foundational national institutions. The revelation of a secret presidential system operating for 2 centuries could indeed trigger a constitutional crisis unlike anything in American history. So where does that leave us? Tom asked. Should we pursue this further or walk away? Mitchell studied him carefully. Can you walk away, Tom, after what happened to your career, after discovering what may be the most significant presidential archive in existence? After learning that the previous owner of Hillcrest likely died because of what he discovered? The question struck at the core of Tom's motivation. Could he abandon this investigation now, knowing what he knew? The truth was he couldn't. Not just because of the historical significance or potential vindication, but because he had crossed a threshold. Too many powerful interests knew he had discovered the vault. Walking away wouldn't ensure his safety. At this point, no, Tom admitted. I can't walk away, but I need to understand what I'm dealing with before proceeding further. If Fort Monroe holds the complete archive, I need more information about its exact location and how the presidential key accesses it. That's why I wanted to meet here rather than at the university, Mitchell said, moving to a bookshelf and removing several volumes. My family has connections to military intelligence going back generations. My grandfather served at Fort Monroe during World War II in a specialized unit tasked with protecting what were called heritage assets. But he never explained what those assets were, but he left journals that might help us. Mitchell placed several leather-bound journals on the desk. These cover his service years from 1939 to 1945. I've been reviewing them since receiving your 8 photos, looking for any references to secure archives or presidential materials at the fort. Tom opened the first journal, scanning entries written in precise handwriting. Most described routine military matters, but occasional passages stood out. April 18th, 1941, assigned to casemate 17 duty, special clearance required. Colonel Matheson emphasized absolute secrecy regarding chamber contents and access protocols. June 12, 1942, presidential visit today. Unusual procedure implemented. Heritage repository accessed according to wartime protocol. Only witnessed from exterior checkpoint, but unusual lighting observed within restricted section. November 3, 1944. Emergency transfer of materials from casemate 17 to secondary location due to storm damage concerns. Temporary relocation authorized directly from White House. Colin Matheson personally supervised movement utilizing Omega team procedures. Tom looked up from the journal. Casemate 17, that could be our location. Casemates are the protected artillery positions built into the fort's walls, but they could also serve as secure storage areas. Mitchell nodded. Fort Monroe has dozens of casemates, many of which have been repurposed over the years for storage, offices, or historically preserved spaces. Number 17 isn't on any public tour or mentioned in historical documentation I can find, which is unusual given how thoroughly the fort has been studied and documented. Your grandfather's journals could be crucial evidence, Tom said. Do they mention the presidential key or how the repository is accessed? Mitchell turned to a flagged page in the second journal. Here, September 1943. Letty Sanders instructed in emergency access protocol for Heritage Repository. Combination of physical access key and presidential cipher required. Key component maintained separately from cipher component as security measure. Current presidential authorization required, except in designated national emergency scenarios. Tom's excitement grew. So the presidential key is indeed two components, a physical key and a cipher system. That aligns with what Walter Hargrove told me, and explains why both would be needed, Mitchell added. Even if someone obtained the physical key without the corresponding cipher, they couldn't make sense of whatever is archived in the repository. But whoever stole the key from Hillcrest might already have the cipher, Tom pointed out, or know where to obtain it. Mitchell's expression darkened. Which means they could potentially access the complete archive at Fort Monroe, assuming they can infiltrate a secure military installation. The implications were sobering. If the presidential key had fallen into the wrong hands, whether government officials seeking to exploit the secret system or guardians determined to expose it, the consequences could be profound. 2 centuries of secret presidential decisions and actions could be weaponized in countless ways, destabilizing the government or fundamentally altering Americans' understanding of their own history. We need to determine who took the key, Tom said, and if possible, recover it before they can access Fort Monroe. And if we recover it? Mitchell asked. What then? Would you expose the archive and its contents to the public? Use it to clear your name, or preserve the system that apparently dozens of presidents have maintained in secret? It was the central ethical question Tom had been avoiding. As a historian, he believed in documentary truth and transparency. But as an American, he recognized that institutions sometimes required certain information to remain classified for legitimate national security reasons. The presidential archive, if it existed as they theorized, blurred the line between legitimate secrecy and unconstitutional deception. I don't know yet, Tom admitted. First, I need to confirm the archive exists and understand exactly what it contains. Then I'll decide what should be done with that knowledge. He gathered the documents he'd brought. But to do any of that, I need to track down the presidential key before whoever took it can use it. Mitchell nodded grimly. I have some contacts who might be able to help identify unusual activity around Fort Monroe, increased security, unscheduled maintenance, unexpected VIP visits. If someone is planning to access the archive, there might be preparatory signs. As they concluded their meeting, Mitchell handed Tom a secure phone. Use this to contact me going forward. It's encrypted and harder to track than your personal phone. And Tom, he added, his expression grave, be extremely careful. If even half of what we suspect is true, you've stumbled onto something that powerful people have killed to protect for generations. The warning was unnecessary. Tom was acutely aware that he was maneuvering through exceptionally dangerous territory, historically, politically, and physically. As he drove back toward Hillcrest in the gathering darkness, he reflected that his desperate purchase of an abandoned farm had led him not just to financial ruin or salvation, but potentially to a historical discovery that could reshape Americans' understanding of their presidency and constitution. Whether that discovery would vindicate him or destroy him remained to be seen, but one thing was certain. Thomas Anderson, disgraced presidential historian, had found a purpose beyond mere survival. He would uncover the truth about the presidential key, the secret archive, and the shadow system of executive power that had apparently operated since the Republic's earliest days. The stakes couldn't be higher, not just for Tom personally, but for the nation whose hidden history he was determined to reveal. After Sheriff Lawson's unsettling visit, Tom spent hours contemplating his next move. The implications of the sheriff's cryptic remarks about Hargrove's death left him increasingly uneasy. If the previous owner had indeed been murdered over what he'd discovered at Hillcrest, Tom could be walking the same dangerous path. Night had fallen by the time Tom made his decision. He needed allies with resources beyond what Mitchell alone could provide. Pulling out the business card Elizabeth Carpenter had left him, he dialed her number. "I didn't expect to hear from you so soon," Elizabeth answered, her voice carrying a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Things have accelerated," Tom replied. "I need to speak with you about Hillcrest's history, specifically about presidential connections that go beyond what appears in official records." A long pause followed. "Meet me at Willow Creek Bridge in 30 minutes. Come alone and make sure you're not followed." The old stone bridge at Willow Creek was barely visible in the moonlight when Tom arrived. Elizabeth's pickup was nowhere in sight, but as he pulled to a stop, headlights flashed briefly from a secluded area beyond the creek. Following the dirt path, Tom found Elizabeth waiting, leaning against her truck with arms crossed. "You found the vault," she stated without preamble. Tom nodded. "And the presidential key that was stored there, though someone took it before I arrived." Elizabeth's posture stiffened. "The key is gone? That changes everything." She glanced around nervously before continuing. "My family has watched over Hillcrest for generations, not as owners, but as guardians. We've observed the government officials who periodically visited during national emergencies, maintained discretion about what we suspected but never confirmed." "Which is what exactly?" Tom pressed. "A presidential secret so profound it could destabilize the government if revealed carelessly." Elizabeth met his eyes directly. "Hillcrest isn't just connected to Monroe through distant relatives. It's the gateway to something Monroe established during his presidency, something subsequently maintained by every administration since. A secret archive of presidential actions taken outside constitutional channels," Tom suggested. Elizabeth's eyebrows rose. "You've pieced together more than I expected. Yes, decisions, communications, and executive actions never documented in official records. Things presidents couldn't acknowledge publicly without triggering constitutional crises. And you believe whoever took the key intends to access this archive?" "It's worse than that," Elizabeth replied. "The key alone isn't enough. It requires a specific cipher that changes with each administration. If someone has obtained both the key and the current cipher, they could potentially expose 2 centuries of secret presidential actions." She paused. "Including those during our country's darkest moments, when presidents made choices they believed necessary for national survival but couldn't justify publicly. "You're suggesting some presidential actions were deliberately kept from congressional oversight or judicial review," Tom said. "I'm stating it plainly," Elizabeth confirmed. "From Washington forward, presidents have occasionally operated outside strict constitutional constraints during existential crises. Those actions were documented, but separately from official records, accessible only to subsequent presidents and a handful of trusted officials." "And the complete archive is hidden where? Not at Hillcrest." Elizabeth shook her head. "The vault you found is merely an antechamber, a secure location for temporary documentation before transfer to the main repository. According to family law, the complete archive is at Jefferson's Overlook." "I've never heard of Jefferson's Overlook," Tom said. "It's not on any map," Elizabeth explained. "It's a location known only to those entrusted with the system's maintenance, a natural cave system reinforced during Monroe's administration, expanded during the Civil War, and modernized periodically since. It lies beneath federal land approximately 20 miles from here." Tom processed this information, its historical implications staggering. If such an archive exists and has operated since Monroe's time, it represents a parallel system of executive authority unknown to the American people, essentially a shadow dimension of presidential power, which is why exposing it carelessly could trigger a constitutional crisis unlike anything since the Civil War, Elizabeth warned. "Imagine the public reaction to learning that every president since Washington has occasionally circumvented constitutional constraints during national emergencies, maintaining documentation of those actions in a secret archive. But perpetuating such a system indefinitely raises equally troubling questions about executive overreach," Tom countered. "If presidents have operated with authority beyond constitutional limits for 2 centuries, where does legitimate emergency power end and unconstitutional action begin?" Elizabeth nodded, acknowledging the dilemma. "That philosophical question has haunted the system's maintainers for generations." Jefferson himself apparently expressed serious misgivings about what he called necessary but extra-constitutional executive discretion, even while participating in the system Washington established. Their discussion was interrupted by the distant sound of an approaching vehicle. Elizabeth tensed, motioning Tom toward the shadows beneath the bridge. They watched silently as a black SUV with government plates drove slowly past, its occupants scanning the surrounding area with flashlights. "Hayes," Tom whispered, once the vehicle had continued down the road. "He's been monitoring Hillcrest since I arrived." "Not just Hayes," Elizabeth murmured. "There are multiple factions interested in the presidential archive. Some want to protect it as a legitimate tool of executive authority during crises. Others seek to expose it as unconstitutional overreach. A few simply want to exploit the information it contains for political advantage or personal gain." "And where do you stand?" Tom asked. Elizabeth's expression grew complicated. "My family has protected Hillcrest's secret for generations without fully knowing what we were protecting. The older I've grown, the more I've questioned whether any presidential system should operate outside constitutional constraints, regardless of the justification." Their conversation was interrupted again, this time by Tom's phone buzzing with a text from Mitchell on the secure device. "Urgent. Activity at JO. Security protocols activated. Source indicates access attempt imminent. Key plus. Cipher confirmed. In unauthorized possession." "Joe, Jefferson's Overlook," Tom realized aloud. "Someone's trying to access the main repository right now." Elizabeth's face paled. "If they succeed and release the contents indiscriminately, the consequences could be catastrophic, not just politically, but potentially for national security." Certain crisis management protocols, intelligence methods, and emergency authorities documented there could compromise ongoing operations if exposed. Tom made an instantaneous decision. We need to get to Jefferson's Overlook immediately. Can you take me there? Elizabeth hesitated only briefly before nodding. It's treacherous terrain, especially at night, but I know the approach routes. My grandfather showed me. She gestured toward her truck. We'll need to hurry if we're going to intercept whoever has the key before they complete access. As they drove through the Virginia countryside, taking back roads and Forest Service paths to avoid potential surveillance, Elizabeth explained what she knew about Jefferson's Overlook. The natural cave system had apparently been discovered during Jefferson's presidency while surveying potential routes for early transportation infrastructure. Its remote location, naturally defensible position, and stable geological features made it ideal for secure storage. Monroe formalized its use during his administration, she explained. The cabinet minutes and public records show he toured the region in 1819 for assessment of federal resource claims. But according to my grandfather, the real purpose was establishing the presidential repository. And it's remained actively used since, Tom asked. Throughout American history, Elizabeth confirmed. Lincoln allegedly reviewed sensitive materials there during the Civil War. Both Roosevelts visited during their administrations. My father witnessed unusual government activity at the site during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Watergate, and after 9/11. Whatever's stored there, presidents have continued accessing it during moments of national emergency. The implications were extraordinary. A continuous chain of presidential knowledge and authority transferred outside official channels for over 2 centuries. Tom's historian's mind raced with questions about how such a system had remained secret despite the thousands of scholarly works examining presidential history and power. After nearly an hour on increasingly primitive roads, Elizabeth parked in a small clearing and gestured toward a densely wooded hillside. We'll have to proceed on foot from here. The overlook is approximately half a mile through those trees, but there's no marked path. They used flashlights sparingly as they navigated the difficult terrain, Elizabeth leading with the confidence of someone who had traveled this route before. Eventually they reached a rocky outcropping that provided a view of the valley below, presumably the feature that had given Jefferson's Overlook its name. The entrance isn't visible from here, Elizabeth whispered. It's concealed beneath that rock formation to the north, accessible only through a narrow passage that typically remains sealed except during authorized access. Tom peered through the darkness, noticing faint lights moving near the location. Elizabeth had indicated. Someone's already there, he murmured. They approached cautiously, using natural cover to avoid detection. As they drew closer, Tom counted 4 individuals, 2 standing guard outside what appeared to be an opening in the rock face, while 2 others worked at some kind of control panel beside a heavy metal door built seamlessly into the stone. That's Judge William Harrington, Elizabeth whispered, indicating an elderly man in a tweed jacket. Former appeals court judge and constitutional scholar, he's rumored to lead a group called the Constitutional Oversight Committee. Academics, former officials, and legal experts who believe the presidential repository represents an unconstitutional usurpation of power. They're the ones who took the presidential key from Hillcrest, Tom realized. As they watched, Harrington inserted what could only be the presidential key into the control panel, while his companion input what appeared to be a numeric sequence, presumably the cipher. After a moment, lights on the panel changed from red to green, and the heavy door began to swing open with the sound of sophisticated mechanics disengaging. "We're too late to prevent access," Elizabeth whispered. "They've already activated the entry system." Tom assessed their options quickly. "We need to see what they're doing before deciding whether to intervene. If they're simply documenting the archive's contents, that may actually serve historical truth. But if they're planning to remove or destroy materials, that would be an incalculable historical loss. They circled to a position where they could observe without being immediately detected, using a secondary path Elizabeth remembered from her grandfather's descriptions. This route brought them to a maintenance access point, a ventilation shaft with a grate that provided limited visibility into what appeared to be an antechamber inside the repository. What Tom saw through the grate took his breath away. Beyond, the antechamber lay a vast chamber carved into the living rock, reinforced with modern structural supports but clearly dating back centuries in its original construction. Lining the walls were shelf after shelf of documents, leather-bound volumes, wooden document boxes, metal filing cabinets from more recent eras, and at the far end, what appeared to be modern digital storage systems. The complete presidential repository, he whispered in awe. 2 centuries of secret executive actions and decisions documented and preserved outside official archives. Harrington and his companion had entered the main chamber and were systematically photographing documents, starting with the oldest materials nearest the entrance. Their process appeared methodical and careful, suggesting documentation rather than destruction was their objective. They're creating a record, Tom observed, presumably for public release. Elizabeth's expression remained troubled. Without proper context or security review, releasing those materials could be disastrous. Some documents likely contain sensitive information about intelligence methods, emergency protocols, or crisis management systems still relevant to national security. Their observation was interrupted by the arrival of another vehicle outside, the black SUV Tom had seen earlier. Hayes and 3 companions emerged, moving with tactical precision toward the repository entrance. The 2 guards posted outside immediately drew weapons, creating a tense standoff. "Federal agents," Hayes announced, displaying identification. "This facility is under government protection. Lower your weapons and step aside." The guards looked, uncertain, glancing toward the open door where Harrington was still working. After a tense moment, they lowered their weapons but didn't move from their positions. "Judge Harrington is documenting historical materials that belong to the American people," one guard stated. "Materials that reveal 2 centuries of unconstitutional executive action." "That determination isn't yours to make," Hayes replied coldly. "These materials contain sensitive information related to national security protocols still in active use. Their indiscriminate release could compromise ongoing operations and emergency response capabilities." The philosophical conflict at the heart of the repository was now playing out in real time. The tension between constitutional governance and national security, between transparency and necessary discretion in executive action. Both sides believed themselves righteous defenders of American principles, yet their positions were fundamentally opposed. Tom made a split-second decision. "We need to intervene," he whispered to Elizabeth. "This confrontation could escalate dangerously, and regardless of who prevails, the historical materials could be damaged or exploited without proper scholarly assessment." Before Elizabeth could object, Tom had moved toward the repository entrance, revealing himself to both the guards and Hayes's team, all weapons immediately oriented in his direction. "Thomas Anderson," Hayes said, surprise evident in his voice. "How did you—" "I followed the evidence from Hillcrest," Tom interrupted, "and I believe I can offer a perspective both sides might consider before this situation deteriorates further." Hayes studied him suspiciously but gestured for his agents to lower their weapons. "Judge Harrington is attempting unauthorized access to classified materials," he stated. "This isn't a historical debate, Anderson. It's a national security matter." "It's both," Tom countered, and treating it as purely one or the other does disservice to the materials themselves and what they represent. He turned toward the repository entrance. I'd like to speak with Judge Harrington directly. After a moment of apparent internal calculation, Hayes nodded reluctantly. One of the guards escorted Tom inside, while the remaining parties maintained their uneasy standoff outside. Inside the repository, Tom found Harrington and his assistant systematically photographing leather-bound volumes from what appeared to be Washington's administration, the very beginning of the secret presidential system. Judge Harrington, Tom called, causing the elderly man to turn in surprise. Thomas Anderson. Harrington recognized him immediately. The presidential historian whose career was destroyed after allegedly leaking classified documents. His eyes narrowed. Your presence here is significant. I discovered the vault at Hillcrest, Tom explained. I've seen enough to understand what this repository represents. A parallel system of presidential authority operating outside constitutional constraints for over 2 centuries. Harrington nodded approvingly. Then you comprehend the gravity of this discovery. Every president since Washington has participated in this extra-constitutional system, documenting actions and decisions that circumvented the checks and balances established by the Constitution itself. He gestured to the materials surrounding them. The American people deserve to know this truth, regardless of how uncomfortable it may be. I agree that historical truth matters, Tom said carefully, but I'm concerned about the method of disclosure. Without proper context and security review, indiscriminate release of these materials could trigger a constitutional crisis while potentially compromising legitimate national security interests. Harrington's expression hardened. That argument has been used for 2 centuries to maintain this secret system. Security concerns become the justification for continued secrecy, and the constitutional violation persists through administration after administration. I'm not advocating for continued secrecy, Tom clarified. I'm suggesting a structured disclosure process that balances historical transparency with legitimate security considerations. A bipartisan commission of historians, constitutional scholars, national security experts, and representatives from all 3 branches of government to review these materials methodically. This proposal gave Harrington pause. You're suggesting institutionalizing the review rather than immediate public disclosure. I'm suggesting that after 2 centuries of secret operation, this system deserves careful dismantling rather than explosive demolition, Tom replied. Not to protect the system itself, but to ensure the historical record is properly contextualized, and legitimate security concerns are addressed responsibly. Their conversation was interrupted by Elizabeth's arrival, escorted by one of Hayes's agents. Seeing her, Harrington's expression changed subtly. A carpenter, he noted. Your family has been connected to this system for generations, though always at arm's length. Which gives me a unique perspective, Elizabeth responded. I've watched the pattern of presidential access to this repository during national crises throughout my lifetime, seen the government officials who arrived at moments of emergency, observed the system operating without ever knowing precisely what it contained. She surveyed the vast archive surrounding them. Now, seeing the actual repository, I understand why such care was taken to maintain its secrecy, and why that secrecy cannot continue indefinitely. Hayes entered behind them, his expression tense but controlled. This facility remains under federal protection, regardless of how you accessed it. I have authority to secure these materials and remove unauthorized persons. Your authority stems from the very system whose legitimacy is in question, Harrington challenged. A system of executive power operating outside constitutional constraints for over 2 centuries. The fundamental conflict remained unresolved: legitimate governance versus security necessity, transparency versus discretion. Tom recognized they had reached an impasse that reflected the central tension of American governance itself. "What if," Tom suggested, addressing both Hayes and Harrington, "we use this moment not to perpetuate the conflict, but to resolve it? The repository's existence can no longer be completely concealed. Too many people know about it now. But neither can its contents be indiscriminately released without potential harm to legitimate national security interests." "What exactly are you proposing?" Hayes asked suspiciously. "A Presidential Archives Transparency Commission," Tom outlined, "established by executive order with congressional consultation, comprising respected historians, constitutional scholars, national security experts, and representatives from all three branches of government. This commission would review the repository's contents methodically, determining what can be released immediately, what requires security review before disclosure, and what legitimately warrants continued classification." The proposal hung in the air between them, neither full transparency nor continued secrecy, but a structured pathway toward reconciling historical truth with security necessity. "The president would never authorize such a commission," Hayes objected. "These materials have remained executive property since Washington's time, precisely because they document actions that bypass normal constitutional constraints during national emergencies." "The president may not have a choice," Harrington countered. "We have documented evidence of the repository's existence and contents. If the administration refuses a structured review process, we can still proceed with public disclosure." It was an extraordinary standoff, the weight of 2 centuries of secret presidential authority against the fundamental constitutional principle that executive power must ultimately answer to the people. Tom recognized that his academic disgrace had unexpectedly positioned him at the fulcrum of this historic confrontation, able to speak to both the legitimate security concerns and the constitutional principles at stake. "Sometimes," Elizabeth observed quietly, "history requires individuals to step beyond their expected roles. My family protected this secret for generations without fully understanding what we were protecting. Historians like you, Tom, have studied presidential power without knowing about this shadow dimension operating alongside it. Judge Harrington has defended constitutional principles without access to this evidence of their systematic circumvention. Even Agent Hayes has served a system whose full nature remained classified beyond his clearance." Her observation highlighted how the repository's secrecy had compartmentalized knowledge, preventing any individual or institution from fully assessing its constitutional implications or historical significance. Tom realized that this moment represented not just a confrontation over specific documents, but a potential inflection point in America's understanding of executive power itself. "I cannot authorize such a commission," Hayes said finally, "but I can present your proposal to those with appropriate authority. In the meantime," he addressed Harrington, "I must insist that no documentation leaves this chamber. The repository remains secured until a determination is made." Harrington considered. This then nodded slowly. "We will suspend our documentation efforts temporarily, but this matter cannot remain unresolved. The Constitutional Oversight Committee has prepared for this moment for decades. If good faith efforts toward transparency are not evident within 30 days, we will proceed with public disclosure regardless of the consequences." This negotiated pause diffused the immediate confrontation, though the underlying constitutional question remained unresolved. Hayes established a security perimeter around the repository entrance, while Harrington's team withdrawn under careful observation. Tom and Elizabeth found themselves in the extraordinary position of having brokered a temporary truce between forces that had operated in opposition since the Republic's earliest days. As they departed Jefferson's Overlook, Tom reflected on the remarkable path that had led him from financial desperation to this pivotal historical moment. His purchase of Hillcrest Farm, motivated by nothing more than the need for affordable shelter, had unexpectedly positioned him to influence how America would confront its own secret presidential history. "What happens now?" Elizabeth asked, as they navigated the difficult terrain back toward her truck. "I don't know," Tom admitted. "Hayes will report to whoever oversees this system within the current administration. Harrington will prepare contingency, plans for disclosure if the government refuses transparency, and he paused, considering his unique position. "I should document everything I've learned about how this parallel system operated. If a commission is established, that historical context will be essential to their work." The weeks that followed brought extraordinary developments. Tom received an official letter delivered by courier containing a presidential appointment to a newly established Special Commission on Executive Historical Materials, scheduled to commence work the following month. His academic credentials had been officially reinstated, with a formal acknowledgement that the previous allegations had been withdrawn based on new information regarding the source of the unauthorized disclosures. The Commission's work would take years to complete, reviewing repository materials chronologically from the Washington administration forward, determining what could be released immediately, what required security review before disclosure, and what legitimately warranted continued classification. The process represented an unprecedented reckoning with the tension between constitutional governance and security necessity that had shaped American history since its founding. For Thomas Anderson, the historian who had lost everything before, finding Hillcrest Farm, this extraordinary opportunity transcended personal vindication. It offered the chance to help Americans understand their governance more truthfully, acknowledging both the constitutional ideals that guided it and the pragmatic compromises presidents had made during moments of national emergency. 1 year after his desperate $700 bid at a county auction, Tom stood on the porch of his now renovated farmhouse, watching the sunset over fields that had begun to produce their first modest crops. The presidential key had been secured with multiple redundancies to prevent unauthorized access. The Commission's work was proceeding constructively despite inevitable political tensions, and Tom himself had found an unexpected peace in the rural lifestyle he had once sworn to avoid. Elizabeth joined him on the porch, their relationship having evolved from cautious neighbors to something deeper over months of shared experiences and confidences. "Ever regret buying this place?" she asked, handing him a mug of coffee. Tom smiled, reflecting on the journey that had begun with his desperate purchase. "It nearly bankrupted me, threatened my life, and forced me to confront fundamental questions about constitutional governance and executive power." "So that's a yes?" Elizabeth teased. "Actually, no," Tom replied, surveying what had once been a dilapidated property and was now a functioning farm and home. "Hillcrest gave me purpose when I had none, connections when I was isolated, and ultimately, the chance to contribute to something historically significant. Hard to regret that, even with all the complications." As darkness settled over the Virginia countryside, Tom considered how his desperate bid on an abandoned farm had led him not just to financial recovery, but to historical discovery and personal redemption. The presidential vault beneath the barn stood secured, but no longer secret, its existence now officially acknowledged as part of the Commission's mandate. What Thomas Anderson had found at Hillcrest Farm wasn't just a hidden chamber of presidential secrets, but a new understanding of American governance, one that acknowledged the tensions between constitutional ideals and practical necessities, between democratic transparency and executive discretion in times of crisis. That understanding, complex and sometimes uncomfortable, represented a more mature perspective on presidential power than either blind faith or cynical dismissal could provide. For a historian who had lost everything pursuing the truth about presidential authority, it was the most valuable discovery imaginable, one worth far more than the $700 he had risked on a dilapidated farm at a county auction. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.